A wild stallion dragged the mountain man to a rotten cabin, but what he found inside shocked him. He thought he was chasing down a horse, yet the door splintered open to reveal a starving widow and her half-Apache child, hiding from a world that wanted them gone. In the glow of a dying fire, secrets were waiting secrets tied to land deeds, broken promises, and a railroad that would stop at nothing. What began as a chance encounter in the snow became a battle between mercy and greed, justice and fear. The town whispers, the church bell tolls, and masked riders gather in the night. But one man's choice could change everything, protect them, or lose them to the flames. When the law is bent, the cabin burned, and the truth buried in a Bible. Who will stand when the smoke clears? Will the mountain man risk everything for a family not his own, or let fear tear them apart forever? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The stallion's hooves splintered the rotting door, sending William Boone sprawling onto rough wooden planks. His fingers, numb from the icy creek crossing, still gripped the rope with stubborn determination. Snow and winter wind howled through the broken entrance, stirring up dust and ash from a nearly dead fire. William blinked hard, trying to clear his vision. The cabin's gloom gave way to a sight that stopped his breath. A woman stood pressed against the far wall, her arms wrapped protectively around a young boy. Both were thin as winter saplings, their faces pale with fear and hunger. The boy's dark eyes, set in features that spoke of mixed blood, darted between William and the snorting stallion still half tangled in the doorway. "Ma'am," William managed, his voice rough from the cold. He slowly pushed himself to his feet, keeping his movements careful and steady. The rope slackened in his grip as the stallion backed away from the wreckage of the door, leaving Winter's bite to sweep freely into the cabin's single room. The woman's chin lifted slightly, though her arms stayed tight around her son. A worn hunting rifle leaned against the wall beside her, just within reach. "This is private property," she said, her words carrying a strength that belied her gaunt appearance. William nodded, feeling the ache of his bruised muscles. Didn't mean to intrude. That horse had other ideas. He gestured toward the splintered door with his free hand. "Name's William Boone. I can fix that door for you, ma'am." The boy whispered something to his mother, too quiet for William to catch. Her expression softened just slightly. The wariness still lined her face. "Corin Whitlock," she said after a long moment. "This is my son, Thomas." William's gaze swept the cabin's interior. The bare shelves held only a few tin cans and jars. A single moth-eaten blanket lay crumpled near the dying embers. His years of mountain living had taught him to read the signs of desperate times, and this cabin spoke volumes of hardship. "Fire's about done," he said, keeping his tone matter-of-fact. "Got dry wood in my saddlebags, if you've a mind to accept." He paused, watching as Corinne's shoulders tensed at the offer. "Along with that door repair, of course. Least I can do for breaking it in the first place." The wind whistled through the broken door, making Thomas shiver. Corinne looked down at her son, then back at William. Something in her expression shifted, like ice beginning to crack under spring's first warmth. "Much obliged," she said quietly, "for the wood and the door." William nodded and turned toward the entrance, where his horse had followed the stallion's trail to the cabin. The rope still in his hand led to the wild horse, now standing quietly in the snow, steam rising from its flanks. He tied both animals to a nearby pine, then retrieved his saddlebags. When he returned, Corinne had moved to the fireplace, trying to coax life back into the embers with what looked like the last of their kindling. Thomas watched from the corner, his dark eyes tracking William's every move. The boy's face held a mixture of fear and curiosity that reminded William of young deer, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. But unable to resist their natural inquisitiveness, William set his saddlebags down and pulled out several pieces of dry pine wood he'd collected earlier. He moved slowly, deliberately, aware of the tension his presence brought to the small space. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the fireplace. Karen stepped back, allowing him access to the hearth. Her arms wrapped around herself, whether from cold or discomfort, William couldn't tell. He arranged the wood carefully, adding small pieces of bark and pine needles from a pouch in his coat. Within minutes, flames began to lick upward, bringing welcome warmth to the cabin's chill interior. "You're good at that," Thomas said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. William glanced at the boy, offering a small smile. "Spent enough winters in these mountains to learn a thing or two about fire-making." He straightened up, brushing ash from his hands. "Your ma giving you permission to speak to strangers?" Thomas looked at Karen, who gave a slight nod. "He can talk," she said, "though he usually doesn't to most folks." Something unspoken lay beneath her words, a history of hurts that William recognized all too well. The fire's growing warmth began to thaw the ice from William's clothes, sending small puddles forming at his feet. Outside, the Stallion nickered, reminding him of the broken door letting in the cold. "Best see to that entrance," he said, turning to examine the splintered wood. "Got some tools in my saddlebags. Won't be pretty, but it'll keep the weather out." Karen watched him, her face a mixture of gratitude and guarded hope. "We don't have much to offer in payment," she began, but William shook his head. "Not looking for payment, ma'am. My horse brought this trouble to your door. Fixing it is just making things right." The cabin fell quiet, except for the crackling fire and the winter wind. In that moment, William felt the weight of all their unspoken stories, his own losses, their evident hardships, and the circumstances that had led them all to this hidden gulch in the Colorado Highlands. He reached for his tools, ready to begin the work of mending what was broken, starting with that splintered door. William cleared his throat, shuffling his feet on the rough floorboards. "Name's William Boone," he said, his gruff voice echoing in the cabin's dim interior. "Don't mean you any harm." Karen's hand shot out, grasping an iron fire poker from beside the hearth. She pulled Thomas closer behind her, the poker raised defensively. "Stay back," she warned, her voice trembling but firm. A thunderous kick from outside made the cabin wall shudder. The Stallion, still tied to the post, was fighting against its restraints. William held up his hands in a peaceful gesture. "Let me see to that horse before he brings the whole place down." He backed slowly toward the broken door, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. Outside, the Stallion danced nervously, its hooves cutting dark crescents in the snow. William spoke softly to the animal, running his hands along its sweating flanks until the horse settled. When he returned to the cabin's interior, Karen still gripped the fire poker, but her stance had softened slightly. The boy coughed, the sound wet and harsh in the smoke-filled room. William reached slowly into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch. "Got some dried venison here," he said, setting the pouch on a rough-hewn table between them. "Might help with that cough," getting something warm in his belly. Karen's eyes darted between the pouch and William's face. Thomas coughed again, and she wavered. Slowly, she lowered the poker. "Why are you helping us?" she asked, suspicion heavy in her voice. William shrugged, settling himself on a wooden stool. "Near the fire. Man finds folks in need. He helps. That's all there is to it." The flames cast dancing shadows across Karen's face as she studied him. Finally, she reached for the pouch, pulling out a strip of venison and handing it to Thomas. The boy took it eagerly, though his eyes never left William. "My husband," Karen began, then stopped, her fingers twisting in her skirt. "He was an Apache scout. Worked for the army at Fort Collins." She swallowed hard. Some men decided they didn't want his kind around anymore, even with his service record. They came in the night 3 months ago. William's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. He'd seen too much of such evil during and after the war. Thomas and I ran, Karen continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Found this old trapper's cabin. Been living on whatever we can find. Roots mostly, some berries before winter set in. Tried hunting, but she gestured to the ancient rifle leaning against the wall. Its stock cracked and weathered. Thomas finished his piece of venison, licking his fingers clean. His dark eyes, so like his father's must have been, watched William with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Another cough racked his small frame, and Karen's face crumpled with worry. Smoke's not helping that cough none, William observed, glancing at the poorly drawing chimney. Outside, darkness was falling fast, the winter sun abandoning the sky to purple twilight. Snow began falling more heavily, driven sideways by the wind that howled through the broken door. Can't leave in this weather, Karen said reluctantly, as if reading his thoughts. Not that I trust you to stay, but she squared her shoulders. You'll freeze if you try riding now. William nodded, reaching for more wood to feed the fire. Reckon you're right about that, ma'am. He settled back, keeping a respectful distance as the flames grew stronger. Mind if I patch that door some? Keep the worst of the cold out? Karen hesitated, then nodded. William rose and began gathering the splintered pieces of wood. As he worked, he could feel Thomas's eyes following his every move. The boy had positioned himself between William and his mother, small shoulders squared protectively despite his obvious exhaustion. The night deepened around the cabin, wind moaning through the pines outside. William managed to wedge the broken door pieces together well enough to block most of the draft. Inside, the fire's warmth began to fill the single room, and Thomas's coughing gradually eased. Karen sat rigid on her threadbare blanket, obviously fighting sleep. The fire poker remained within easy reach of her hand. William settled himself near the door, his back against the wall, making it clear he had no intention of approaching them during the night. Get some rest, he said quietly. I'll keep the fire going. Thomas had already curled up beside his mother, his breathing growing deeper and more regular. Karen's eyes met William's across the firelit space, grateful but still wary, a wounded animal accepting help, but ready to flee at the first sign of betrayal. The cabin fell silent except for the pop and crackle of burning wood and the winter storm's fury outside. William kept his vigil by the door, watching the small family through the night's long hours, knowing he couldn't possibly leave them to face the wilderness alone. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow-laden clouds in shades of pearl and rose. William stood in the cabin's doorway, watching the first light filter through the pines. His muscles ached from sleeping upright against the wall, but he kept his word. The fire had burned steady through the night dot behind him. Karen stirred on her blanket, Thomas still curled against her side. The boy's breathing sounded clearer. This morning, the one night of warmth wouldn't be enough. William tugged his coat tighter, his mind made up. Got a line shack about 4 miles north, he said quietly, turning to face Karen. Been meaning to bring supplies down anyway. Could fetch some flour, beans, maybe tools to fix this place proper. Karen sat up slowly, smoothing Thomas's dark hair. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. William adjusted his hat, buying time before answering. No one should face winter alone, he said finally. The words hung in the cold morning air between them. Outside, the stallion nickered softly as William approached. The horse had settled somewhat. Overnight, though its eyes still rolled when William reached for the reins. He swung into the saddle, feeling Karen and Thomas watching from the doorway. I'll be back by afternoon, he promised. Got my word on that. The stallion picked its way carefully through the deep snow, hooves breaking through the crusty surface. As they climbed out of the gulch, memories William usually kept buried began surfacing like stones in spring thaw. Sarah's face appeared in his mind, his wife, gone these 7 years. She'd been carrying their first child when the war reached their Tennessee farm. The fever took them both while he was away scouting for the Union Army. By the time he returned, he found only 2 wooden crosses and an empty cabin. The bitter wind stung his eyes, or perhaps it was something else that made them water. The stallion snorted, breath streaming in the cold air, as if sensing his rider's dark thoughts. William's line shack appeared through the swirling snow, a humble structure but solid against the elements. Inside, he gathered what he could spare: 2 precious bags of flour, dried beans, salt pork, and a few tools. He hesitated by his shelf of books, then added his wife's old Bible. Something told him Karen might appreciate it. Loading the supplies took time in the deep snow. The stallion stood quietly now, as if understanding the importance of its burden. William wrapped everything carefully in oilcloth against the weather. The return journey seemed longer, though the horse knew the way. By the time they descended into the gulch, the weak winter sun had passed its peak. Smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, a welcome sight in the gathering afternoon gloom. Thomas burst through the door as William dismounted, his small face alight with relief. "Mama, he came back!" Karen appeared more slowly, wariness still evident in her stance. But when William began unpacking the supplies, her eyes widened. "This is too much," she protested, even as her hands reached for the flour sack. "We can't." "Repay." "Ain't asking for payment," William cut in gruffly. He carried the supplies inside, setting them on the rough table. Now, about that door. While he worked, fitting new hinges and straightening the warped wood, Karen moved about the cabin with fresh energy. Soon, the smell of biscuits baking in the newly cleaned fireplace filled the small space. Thomas watched William's every move, handing him nails when asked, his earlier shyness beginning to fade. "Mr. Boone," Karen said suddenly, her voice tight, with something unspoken, "there's something you should see." She disappeared into the shadows at the back of the cabin, returning with a leather portfolio wrapped in oilcloth. Her hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped it. These were James's, my husband's papers. She spread several documents on the table, careful to keep them away from the flour dust. "This is our deed. The survey maps show 50 acres down in the valley where the creek widens. Good water rights, timber too." William studied the papers, noting the official stamps and careful measurements. "Legal and proper," he observed. "Why aren't you on your own land?" Corinne's fingers traced the map's edges. James said, before she swallowed hard. He heard rumors about the railroad planning a new route. Said some men might try to cause trouble, claim our rights weren't valid because of who he was. That's why we're hiding. Outside, the stallion whinnied softly. William glanced through the window, surprised to see the horse standing quietly, head lowered peacefully. Something about the animal's changed demeanor struck him as important, though he couldn't say why. "These papers are solid," he said, turning back to Karen. "Ain't right for you to be living like outlaws on your own land." Thomas pressed against his mother's side, his young face serious. "Papa said we must never lose the papers. They're our future." William nodded, understanding now why Karen had chosen this hidden gulch. She wasn't just hiding from men's hatred. She was protecting her son's inheritance. The snow began falling harder as evening approached, thick flakes swirling down from slate-gray skies. William stood at the cabin window, watching the weather worsen. No chance of safe travel tonight, not with a woman and child. "Reckon we're all bunking here another night," he announced, turning from the darkening view. "Storm setting improper now." Thomas looked up from his spot by the fire, relief crossing his young face. The boy had been quiet most of the afternoon, but his eyes followed William's every movement with growing curiosity. "Sir?" Thomas's voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you catch many animals out here?" William settled onto a rough-hewn stool, considering the question. "Fair amount. Mostly beaver and marten in these parts. Some fox, too, when they're running." "Could you?" Thomas glanced at his mother, then back to William. "Could you show me?" "How?" Karen nodded slightly from where she sat, mending a torn sleeve. Giving her son permission to ask more, William reached for his hunting knife and a piece of pine kindling. "First thing about trapping is understanding the snare," he said, beginning to whittle the soft wood. "Simple tool, but it takes knowing how creatures think." Thomas scooted closer, watching intently as William's knife shaped the wood with practiced strokes. The firelight caught the blade's movement, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. "See here," William continued, his usual gruffness softening as he taught. "You want the loop just so natural-like, nothing to spook the game." His weathered hands demonstrated the technique, showing how the snare would work. Karen's needle slowed as she listened, her earlier wariness easing somewhat. The familiar sounds of the fire and William's quiet instruction filled the cabin with an unexpected warmth. As the evening deepened, Thomas absorbed every detail, asking careful questions about tracking and woodcraft. William found himself sharing knowledge he'd held close for years, surprised by how natural it felt to teach again. That morning brought clearer skies but deeper snow. William stood outside, studying the rotten cabin's sagging walls with growing concern. The structure had barely survived the night's storm. "This place won't last another week," he said firmly when Karen joined him. "Roof's like the cave with the next heavy snow." Karen wrapped her shawl tighter, knowing he spoke truth but hesitant to accept what that meant. "We have nowhere else to go. "My cabin's solid," William said, the words coming before he could second-guess them. "Got room enough. At least until spring lets you get down to your valley land." Thomas appeared in the doorway, clutching their few possessions already wrapped in a quilt. "Mama, please. Mr. Boone's cabin has a real stove." Karen's eyes met William's, searching for any hint of deception. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "Very well. Thank you." Loading their meager belongings took little time. The Stallion stood quietly as William secured their bundles, its wild spirit seemingly tempered by some new understanding. The journey through the deep snow was slow and careful. William led the horse, with Karen and Thomas huddled in the saddle. The boy clutched his mother's waist, wide-eyed at the winter landscape they passed through. By early afternoon, William's cabin came into view. Through the trees, though simple, its sturdy logs and well-maintained roof promised real shelter. "It's like a fortress," Thomas whispered in awe as they approached. William helped them dismount, noting how Karen's eyes swept over the cabin's solid construction. The iron stove inside already radiated welcome heat. He'd banked the coals well before leaving. Thomas hurried to warm himself by the stove, rubbing his cold hands together. "Mama, look! There's shelves with books." Karen moved slowly through the cabin's single room, taking in the neat organization of tools, supplies, and small comforts accumulated over years of solitary living. "You've made a real home here," she said softly. William busied himself storing their belongings, uncomfortable with the praise. But as he watched Thomas exploring every corner with growing excitement and Karen beginning to relax her guard, something shifted inside him. The cabin felt different now, warmer somehow. Despite the winter pressing against its walls, the silence that had been his only companion for so long was broken by Thomas's quiet questions and Karen's gentle movements. He was no longer alone. The realization settled over him like a familiar blanket, both comforting and terrifying. He turned to stack firewood, hiding whatever emotions might show on his face. But he couldn't deny the truth of it. His solitary World had changed the moment that Wild Stallion had led him to their door. Life settled into an uneasy rhythm at William's cabin. The first morning, Karen woke before dawn, moving quietly through the dim space to kindle the stove. William, already outside splitting logs, paused at the sound of cooking pots clanking inside. The familiar scent of coffee soon drifted through the cracks around the door. "Breakfast's ready," Karen called softly when he entered, snow dusting his shoulders. A pot of beans simmered on the stove, and the aroma of fresh cornbread filled the cabin. William nodded his thanks, unused to having hot food waiting. They ate in awkward silence, broken only by Thomas's quiet requests for more bread. The days fell into a patter. William would rise early to tend the horses and chop wood, the steady thunk of his axe marking time through the morning. Karen kept the cabin, stretching their supplies with careful planning. Thomas found his own place in their strange arrangement, spending hours in the barn with the stallion. "He's gentled down some," William observed one afternoon, watching through the barn door as Thomas offered hay to the horse. The boy had a natural way with the animal, speaking to it in soft Apache words that William didn't understand. "His father taught him about horses," Karen explained, her voice catching slightly. Before, William turned back to his work, giving her privacy with her grief. On the fifth day, a hunter passed by, his eyes widening at the sight of Karen hanging wash, while Thomas helped William repair a broken fence. The man tipped his hat, politely enough, but his hurried departure told William that news would spread fast. "Folks will talk," he warned Karen that evening. She straightened her spine. They always do. Sunday arrived clear and cold. William hitched his wagon, helping Karen and Thomas climb aboard. The boy wore his best shirt, though it was worn thin at the elbows. "We don't have to go," William offered, seeing Karen's tension. "Yes, we do," she replied firmly. "Hiding only makes things worse." The little church sat on the edge of town, its white-painted boards bright against the snow. As William helped them down from the wagon, he felt the weight of stares from those gathering for service. Inside, the whispers started immediately. William led them to a back pew, but there was no hiding from the curious glances and disapproving frowns. He heard fragments of conversation. "That's the Apache scout's widow. Poor woman, all alone. Half-breed child, living with that mountain man." Thomas pressed closer to his mother's side, his young face carefully blank. Karen held her hymnal with white-knuckled hands, but kept her head high. The preacher's sermon seemed to last forever. William found himself watching the door, noting those who entered late. Among them was a well-dressed man he didn't recognize, wearing an Eastern-cut coat and polished boots. "Silas Kettering," Karen whispered, her face paling slightly. "The railroad's agent." William studied the man more carefully. Kettering stood near the back, his cold eyes fixed on Karen and Thomas. There was calculation in that gaze, not Christian charity. When the final hymn ended, William tried to guide them quickly to the wagon. But the crowd pressed in, some offering genuine welcomes, others barely hiding their judgment behind false smiles. Double quotes, Mrs. Whitlock. Kettering's smooth voice cut through the chatter. He approached them, hat in hand. "I was sorry to hear about your husband. The railroad lost a valuable scout when he passed." Karen's grip on Thomas's shoulder tightened. "Thank you, Mr. Kettering. I've been meaning to discuss your situation." He continued, "Perhaps we could meet this week? There are some matters regarding your land claim that need attention." "My husband's deed is legal and filed properly," Karen replied, her voice steady despite her obvious discomfort. Kettering's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Even so, there are always complications. Best to address them early." William stepped forward, placing himself between Kettering and Karen. "Mrs. Whitlock will contact you if she needs to discuss anything." The agent's gaze flickered to William, assessing. After a moment, he nodded and stepped back. "As you wish." "Good day." Mrs. Whitlock, young Thomas. They rode home in silence, the wagon wheels creaking through fresh snow. Thomas huddled between them, his earlier brightness dimmed by the morning's tensions. "That man," William said finally. "He's trouble." Karen nodded, staring straight ahead. "The railroad wants our valley. Land. They tried to buy it before." She swallowed hard. "Before my husband died, he wouldn't sell." William thought of Kettering's cold eyes, the way he'd looked at Thomas. This wasn't over. The agent's appearance at church had been no coincidence. The cabin came into view, solid and welcoming after the strain of town. As William helped them down from the wagon, he noticed Karen's hands were shaking slightly. "We'll figure it out," he said gruffly, surprising himself with the promise. Karen met his eyes for a moment, then nodded. Thomas had already hurried to the barn, seeking comfort from the Stallion. The boy's quiet voice drifted out, speaking Apache. Words of reassurance to the horse. 3 sharp knocks on the cabin door broke the morning quiet. William set down his coffee cup, catching Karen's startled look from where she stood at the stove. Thomas, who had been whittling by the fire, pressed closer to his mother's skirts. "Stay here," William said quietly, moving to answer. Silas Kettering stood on the porch, looking perfectly pressed despite the early hour and muddy trail. A sleek bay horse waited behind him, its Easter-made saddle gleaming with brass fittings. "Mr. Boone," Kettering smiled broadly. "I thought I'd pay a neighborly call. May I come in?" William hesitated, but refusing would only draw more attention. He stepped back, letting the railroad agent enter. "Mrs. Whitlock," Kettering tipped his hat. "Young Thomas. I hope I'm not interrupting your breakfast." "Not at all," Karen replied, stiffly, though her hands twisted in her apron. "Would you care for coffee?" "That would be most kind." William watched as Kettering settled himself at the table, noting how the man's eyes swept the cabin's interior, lingering on the trunk where Karen kept her papers. Karen set a tin cup before their unwanted guest, then drew Thomas to the far corner, where his bedroll lay. The boy began sorting through his small collection of carved animals, but his dark eyes never left Kettering. "Fine boy you have there," Kettering observed, sipping his coffee. "Must be difficult, raising him alone." "We manage," Karen answered. Of course. Though I imagine your husband's death has left many matters unsettled." Kettering sat, his cup down carefully. The railroad was quite concerned to learn of his passing. There were several pending agreements regarding land use. William's jaw tightened. "Seems to me any agreements would be in writing." "Oh, indeed they were. Which is why I'd be very interested in reviewing any papers Mrs. Whitlock might have inherited. To ensure everything is in order, you understand." "The papers are fine where they are," William said flatly. Kettering's pleasant expression didn't waver. "Mrs. Whitlock, surely you see the wisdom in letting me examine the documents? The railroad has significant interests in this valley. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings." Karen straightened her spine. "My husband was very clear about his wishes for our land." "Your husband," Kettering said carefully, "may not have fully understood the complexities of property law, especially given his background." William stood, abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "I believe we're done here." Kettering rose more smoothly, brushing invisible dust from his coat. "As you wish. But this matter won't simply go away, Mrs. Whitlock. Better to address it now, while terms can still be generous." After the agent left, Karen sank into a chair, her face pale. Thomas crept to her side, pressing against her arm. "He wants our land," she whispered. "The valley has the only reliable water source for miles. The railroad needs it for their new line." She looked up at William, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "It's what they were pressuring John about before he died. He wouldn't sell, said it was our son's future." William paced the small cabin, thinking. Those papers, are you certain? They're proper? John said they were filed with the county clerk, but I've never seen the records myself. Then that's where we start. William grabbed his coat. Day after tomorrow, we ride to town. 2 days later, they left Thomas with the preacher's wife and entered the county clerk's office. The room smelled of dust and old paper, with rows of leather-bound books lining the walls. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, peered at them over wire-rimmed spectacles. Land records, you say? For the Whitlock claim? Karen produced the deed and survey maps from her shawl. The clerk took them carefully, comparing them to several thick volumes he pulled from the shelves. Minutes stretched into an hour as he checked and rechecked entries. William stood guard by the door, watching the street through grimy windows. Karen sat rigid in a hard wooden chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Finally, the clerk looked up. Everything appears to be in order. The deed was properly filed and recorded. Moreover, he adjusted his spectacles. It's protected under the terms of the Apache Scout Service Treaty of 1866. Your husband's service earned him special consideration. Karen's shoulders sagged in relief, but the clerk wasn't finished. However, he said quietly, you should know this will cause trouble. The railroad has already filed intent to survey that valley for their new line. They won't take kindly to a competing claim, especially one held by, he hesitated, by a widow and her half-Apache son? Karen finished bitterly. The clerk nodded uncomfortably. They have powerful friends in the territorial government. Money, too, for lawyers and such. The law is the law, William growled. Treaty rights can't just be ignored. Perhaps not ignored, the clerk said carefully, but they can be challenged, delayed, tied up in court until defending them becomes too costly. He began returning the papers to Karen. I'd be very careful with these, Mrs. Whitlock. They're your only protection, and some folks might find it convenient if they were to disappear. Karen clutched the documents to her chest, her face set with determination. They'll have to. Take them from my cold hands first. William guided her out of the office, his mind already turning over plans to secure the papers and protect the small family that had unexpectedly become his responsibility. The morning after their visit to the clerk's office, urgent pounding at the cabin door startled them from breakfast. William opened it to find Reverend Parker and 2 townsmen supporting a pale, sweating Meyer between them. Pneumonia's got hold of him bad, the Reverend explained breathlessly. Doc's away delivering twins up near Silver Creek. Folks said the widow Whitlock knows healing ways. Karen was already clearing the table. Bring him here, she directed, spreading a blanket. Thomas, fetch water and my herb pouch. The miner, barely conscious, wheezed terribly as they laid him down. His name was Jim Foster, they learned, new to the camps and without family nearby. Karen worked quickly, brewing a strong tea of wild cherry bark and horehound from her dwindling supplies. Some folks weren't sure about coming to you, Reverend Parker admitted quietly as Karen tended the sick man. But pneumonia has been taking too many this winter. Sickness doesn't care about prejudice, Karen replied, lifting Foster's head too. Help him drink. Neither should medicine. Through that day and night, Karen barely left Foster's side. She placed hot mustard plasters on his chest, spoon broth between his cracked lips, and sang soft Apache healing songs her husband had taught her. William kept the fire stoked high, while Thomas helped by bringing fresh snow to cool the miner's fever. Word spread through town. By the next afternoon, several wives arrived with food and offers to help. They watched Karen work, noting her gentle hands and quiet prayers. When Foster's fever finally broke on the 3rd day, even his fellow Myers came to pay respects. Much obliged, ma'am, Foster rasped when he could finally sit up. Reckon I owed you my life. You owe me nothing, Karen smiled, helping him sip more tea. Just get well. As Foster recovered, other changes bloomed like early spring flowers. Sarah Parker, the preacher's 12-year-old daughter, began visiting regularly with books for Thomas. The two children would sit for hours by the fire, heads bent over worn copies of Robinson Crusoe and Pilgrim's Progress. Pa says reading builds character, Sarah explained earnestly, and Thomas reads better than half the boys in Sunday school. William watched the children's friendship grow while he worked to strengthen the cabin against deepening winter. He replaced worn chinking between logs, built proper shutters for the windows, and extended the lean-to for more firewood storage. Each improvement felt like adding another stitch to the fabric of their shared life. One crisp morning, he found Karen studying his handiwork on the new fence around the vegetable patch. "You're making it awful permanent," she observed carefully. William tested a post before answering. "Reckon a home needs good fences." Her smile warmed him more than the winter sun, but dark clouds gathered even as their small family found its footing. Silas Kettering worked tirelessly, spreading whispers through saloons and shop corners. The railroad would bring prosperity, he claimed. Jobs for every man, markets for every farmer. Unless, he added significantly, certain parties blocked progress. With fraudulent land claims. That Apache scout's widow. Townsfolk would hear him say, "She's sitting on papers that could ruin everything." Railroad might just bypass the whole valley if they can't get their right-of-way. Then where would we all be? Some folks stood firm against his hints, remembering Karen's kindness to Foster. Others wavered, counting on railroad prosperity. The tension crackled like static before a storm. Yet inside their cabin, peace held sway. Evening fires cast dancing shadows as Thomas practiced his letters. Karen mended clothes, and William carved new toys from pine scraps. Sometimes they would sing hymns together, Karen's clear voice carrying the melody while Thomas and William rumbled along below. "My husband would be glad," Karen said one night as she tucked Thomas into bed, "to see his son safe and learning and loved." William looked up from oiling his rifle. "You're both safe here," he said gruffly, "long as I draw breath." Thomas stirred sleepily. "Tell about the wild stallion again, Mr. Boone. How he brought you to us. That ornery beast?" William's eyes crinkled. "Well, I reckon sometimes the good Lord uses strange tools to point a man where he needs to go." The boy drifted off to William's familiar tale, while outside their warm circle, snow fell thick and silent. Karen settled in her rocking chair, needles clicking steadily as she knitted. The fire popped and hissed, filling the cabin with the scent of pine. For now, at least, they had this. A home built of shared meals and stories, of helping hands and healing hearts. Whatever storms gather beyond their walls would have to wait for another day. Snow crunched under William's boots as he led his pack mule down the icy main street. Winter pelts, beaver, mink, and fox were bundled tight across the mule's back. The trading post bell jingled as he stepped inside, stamping snow from his feet. "Fine catch there, Boone," old Marcus Thompson said, examining a silver fox pelt. "Ought to fetch enough for whatever supplies you're needing." William sorted through his mental list. Sugar and flour mainly. Maybe some peppermint sticks. He hesitated, then added gruffly, "And cloth, if you've got any pretty calico." Marcus's eyes twinkled knowingly as he measured flour into a sack. The store was decked with pine garlands, and red ribbon boughs adorned the shelves. Christmas was coming, bringing memories William hadn't faced in years. As Marcus tallied the goods, voices drifted through the thin wall from the saloon next door. William recognized Silas Kettering's smooth tone. "Papers or no papers, that Apache widow won't last the winter," Silas was saying. "Two men could do it quiet-like. Scare her off proper. Torch the cabin, if need be. Railroads paying good money to clear that land. Ain't right, someone protested weakly. Woman's got a boy. Boy's half-breed anyway, a third voice cut in. Better off in a government school, learning civilized ways. William's hands clenched on the counter. Marcus carefully wrapped peppermint sticks in paper, pretending not to hear. Much obliged, William managed, gathering his purchases. The ride home was long and cold, dark thoughts churning beneath his calm exterior. Corinne met him at the door, cheeks flushed from baking. Thomas found the perfect pine boughs, she said, helping unload packages. We've been waiting for you to hang them. William forced a smile, tucking his worries away. The cabin smelled of gingerbread, and Thomas bounced excitedly on his toes, holding an armful of fragrant greenery. Show me where you want them, William said, taking off his coat. Together, they draped pine branches along the mantel and wound them around the window frames. Karen produced red yarn boughs she'd made secretly, and Thomas carefully tied them to the greenery. It's like the garden back home, Thomas said softly. Papa always brought in pine boughs for Mama at Christmas. Karen hugged them close, meeting William's eyes over their boy's dark head. The simple decorations transformed their cabin into something magical as evening fell. Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold. They hitched the wagon early, wrapping in quilts for the ride to town. The little church glowed with lamplight, wreaths on its doors and candles in every window. Glory to God in the highest, Reverend Parker intoned, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men. The familiar words washed over William as he sat beside Karen and Thomas in their usual pew. The boy leaned against him, drowsy with warmth and the late hour. Karen's hand found his in the shadows. After the service, the congregation gathered outside despite the cold. Women shared cookies and hot cider while children played in the snow. Thomas led the stallion proudly from where it had been tied, showing off how it responded to his gentle commands. Look at that, Sarah Parker called to her friends. He's got it following like a lamb. A crowd of children gathered to watch as Thomas demonstrated the tricks he'd learned from William. The stallion, once half wild, now dropped its head to let small hands pat its nose. You've done well with that horse, Reverend Parker said quietly beside William. With all of them, truth be told. William watched as Curran helped Thomas dismount, her laugh carrying bright across the snow. Something warm unfurled in his chest, a feeling he'd thought long buried with his first family. The Lord works in mysterious ways, the preacher continued. Sometimes, he has to break down walls before he can rebuild. Before William could respond, Sarah ran up with a small package wrapped in brown paper. For Thomas, she said shyly. From Papa's library, it was a worn copy of Swiss Family Robinson. Thomas's eyes shone as he traced the gilt letters on the spine. More gifts appeared, mittens knitted by the miller's wife, maple candy from the store, a hand-carved top from the carpenter. Each small offering wrapped in paper or cloth, given with smiles that held no trace of their former prejudice. Karen received a basket of dried herbs from the doctor's wife, and a fine lace collar that had belonged to Marcus Thompson's late daughter. Her eyes glistened as she accepted each gift. Even William found himself handed packages, new wool socks, ammunition for his rifle, a silver watch fob the blacksmith had made. The generosity overwhelmed him. As they loaded the wagon for home, William helped Karen up to the seat. In the lamplight from the church, her face glowed with happiness. Thomas sat between them, clutching his new book. The stars burned bright and cold overhead as they drove home, sleigh bells jingling softly. William felt joy expanding in his chest with each breath, pure and sharp as the winter air, warm as the family beside him. The new year crept closer as December's heavy snows began to melt. Warm Chinook winds swept down from the mountains, turning drifts to slush and exposing patches of frozen earth. William noticed the changing weather with uneasy easier travel meant more trouble could find them in town. The saloon buzzed with activity as men gathered after their day's work. Silas Kettering held court at the long bar, his voice carrying above the general murmur. "That Apache claim is holding up progress," he declared, tapping his glass for emphasis. "Railroad's ready to hire 50 men for track laying come spring. Good wages, steady work for months." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But that woman's fraudulent deed blocks the whole project." Murmurs of discontent rippled through the crowd. Times had been lean, and the promise of railroad money tempted many. "Ain't right," declared Tom Wesley, a farmer whose crops had failed. "One woman's stopping honest folk from feeding their families." "And living with that mountain man," another voice added. "No proper marriage neither." Silas nodded gravely, though his eyes glittered with satisfaction. "Sometimes folks need encouragement to do what's right. Move along peaceful-like before someone gets hurt." As evening deepened into night, more men drifted into the saloon. Whiskey flowed freely, Silas making sure no glass stayed empty for long. Talk grew louder, angrier. By 10 o'clock, a dozen men had gathered in the alley behind the saloon, pulling strips of cloth over their faces dotted William's cabin. Curran tucked Thomas into his bed in the small room they'd added on. "Sleep well, little one," she whispered, smoothing his dark hair. William sat at the table cleaning his rifle, a habit from his trapping days. The fire crackled low in the hearth, and wind whistled through the pine boughs still decorating the windows. The first warning was the thunder of hooves in the yard. William grabbed his rifle as shadows passed across the windows. "Get down," he shouted, just as the first shot shattered glass and splintered the doorframe. Curran scrambled to Thomas's room as more bullets punched through the walls. William returned. Fire from beside the window, and a cry of pain told him he'd found a target. "Burn them out," a voice commanded. Flaming torches arced through the broken windows, setting the curtains ablaze. Smoke began to fill the cabin. William fired again, and again, but there were too many. The door crashed inward under the weight of several men. He swung his rifle like a club, catching one attacker across the face. Another tackled him from behind, driving him to the floor. Boots kicked him mercilessly as he tried to rise. A final blow to the head sent him spiraling into darkness. Curran heard the fighting stop. Clutching Thomas to her chest, she eased open the back window of their room. The boy whimpered softly as she helped him through. "Run to the woods," she whispered urgently. "Don't look back." They fled into the darkness as flames engulfed their home. Thomas sobbed silently against her shoulder as they pushed through deep snow. Behind them, men shouted and laughed, their voices carried on the wind. "Found it!" someone called triumphantly. "The deed's right here in this tin box." Curran's heart clenched. All her husband's careful planning, the future he'd tried to secure. For them, gone in a single night of violence. They huddled under a stand of thick pines, watching their world burn. The cabin's roof collapsed in a shower of sparks that lit the night sky. Karen pressed Thomas's face against her coat, trying to shield him from the sight. "Papa," he cried softly. "What about Mr. William?" "Hush now," she soothed, though her own heart ached with fear for the man who'd become so dear to them both. "We have to stay quiet." The riders finally departed, their whoops and hollers fading into the distance. Karen waited until the last hoof beat died away before creeping back toward the smoldering ruins. She found William sprawled in the snow near what remained of the front door. Blood matted his hair and stained the ground around him. Her hands trembled as she felt for a pulse in his neck. "He's alive," she breathed. "Thomas, help me." Together, they managed to drag William away from the heat of the burning cabin. The Stallion had broken free during the attack but hadn't run far. It stood watching them from the edge of the trees, Steam rising from its flanks, dawn began to pale the eastern sky as Karen tended William's wounds. The cabin was nothing but ashes now, there. Few possessions destroyed. Most devastating of all was the loss of the deed, their only proof of rightful. Most devastating of all was the loss of the deed, their only proof of rightful ownership to the valley land. Thomas huddled close, his young face streaked with tears and soot. "What do we do now, Mama?" Karen pulled him close, watching the sun rise over their ruined home. Everything they'd built together lay in ashes around them, and William still hadn't stirred. The new year would bring challenges she couldn't yet imagine. The church basement smelled of damp stone and old hymnals. Karen sat on a narrow cot, watching William's labored breathing in the dim light from the coal oil lamp. His face was a map of bruises, and each breath made him wince from broken ribs. The preacher had helped them here after finding them, huddled in the burned ruins of the cabin at first light. Thomas curled in the corner on a pile of moth-eaten blankets, his dark eyes following every movement in the shadows. The boy hadn't spoken much since the attack, carrying a stillness that broke Karen's heart. "How are you feeling?" she asked softly, touching William's forehead to check for fever. He caught her hand, his grip weak but determined. "Been worse," he rasped. "During the war," he trailed off, coughing. Karen squeezed his fingers. "Don't talk. Rest." Footsteps creaked on the stairs, and Thomas tensed. But it was only the preacher's wife bringing a pot of bean soup and cornbread. She set the food down quietly, her face pinched with worry. "Some folks are asking questions," she whispered. "Silas has been in town all day, telling tales." "What kind of tales?" Karen asked, though she already knew. "Says you forged the deed. Says William here attacked honest men first." The woman wrung her hands. "My husband's trying to speak sense to people, but Silas holds the purse strings." William finished bitterly. After the woman left, Karen spooned soup into a tin bowl. The basement's chill seeped into her bones as she helped William sit up to eat. 3 days they'd been here now, hiding like criminals. "I don't understand," she whispered later, after Thomas had fallen into fitful sleep. "We did everything right. Followed the law. Showed kindness where we could." Her voice cracked. "Where's God's mercy in all this?" William shifted painfully on the cot. "Maybe mercy ain't always what we expect it to look like." "Mama?" Thomas's small voice came from the corner. He padded over on bare feet, climbing onto the cot beside them. "I don't want to run anymore." His lower lip trembled. "I want a home. Like we had." Karen gathered him close, her throat tight. "I know, sweetheart. I know. We ain't running," William said firmly. He pushed himself straighter, grimacing at the pain. "That land is yours by law and right. Your husband earned it serving this territory. We'll find a way." The preacher came down after sunset, carrying more blankets and a worried expression. "Silas was at the town meeting today," he reported. "Promising jobs, growth, prosperity if the railroad gets its way." "And if we don't give up the land?" Karen asked. The preacher's silence was answer enough. He set down the blankets and pulled up a wooden chair. "I want to help, truly. But Silas has most folks believing his version now. The bank, the merchants, even the sheriff seems convinced. So that's it." William's voice was hard. "Justice doesn't matter when money talks." "I didn't say that." The preacher leaned forward. "I'm offering what shelter I can. Food, medicine. But I won't lie, Silas holds powerful sway in this town." After he left, William lay back, his breathing ragged. Karen could see him fighting the pain, the helplessness. His hands kept clenching. Into fists, days crept by in the basement gloom. William slowly regained strength, though his ribs would take weeks to heal properly. Karen watched him doing small exercises, pushing against the walls, testing his limits. There was a dangerous light growing in his eyes. One evening, as Thomas practiced his letters by lamplight, William beckoned Karen closer. "Been thinking," he murmured. "That deed may be gone, but there's other papers. County records, survey maps, treaties." "Silas will have thought of those," Karen said. "Maybe, but he can't destroy every copy." William's jaw set stubbornly. "And there's folks who knew your husband. Other scouts, army officers, witnesses. It would take time to find them. Money we don't have. Then we'll earn it." His hand found hers in the shadows. "I ain't giving up, Karen. Not on you. Not on Thomas. Not on what's right." Thomas looked up from his letters, hope flickering across his young face for the first time in days. "Are we going to fight back, Mr. William?" "Yes, son, we are." William's voice carried the quiet strength that had first drawn Karen to trust him. "But we're going to do it smart. Do it right." Karen felt tears press against her eyes, not of despair this time, but of fierce gratitude for this man who refused to abandon them. She remembered her husband's words about standing tall when the world tried to bend you low. The basement was cold and damp, their future uncertain. But as Thomas crawled between them on the narrow cot, Karen felt something solid taking root in her heart. They were wounded, homeless, nearly hopeless, but they were together. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to start rebuilding. William moved carefully through the town's muddy streets, each step sending sharp pains through his healing ribs. The late January wind cut through his coat, but he pressed on. He had work to do. The miner's cabin sat on the outskirts, smoke curling from its chimney. William knocked, and Jim Cooper opened the door, his weathered face brightening with recognition. Come in. Jim ushered him inside. Been meaning to visit, after hearing what happened. The cabin was humble but warm. William eased himself onto a chair while Jim poured coffee. That wife of yours, Jim said. She saved my life when the fever hit. Knew just which herbs to use. Sat with me through the worst nights. He shook his head. Ain't right what Silas and his bunch did to you. Folks. No, it ain't, William agreed. But that's why I'm here. Need to know if you be willing to speak up. Tell folks what kind of person Karen really is. Jim didn't hesitate. Already been doing that. Got 3, maybe 4 fellows from the mine. Who'll stand with you? Good men who don't cotton the bullies, no matter how rich they are. William felt a small spark of hope. Every ally mattered. Across town, at the schoolhouse, Miss Sarah Bennett sat at her desk, carefully writing in her precise hand. The territorial judge was a 3-week ride away, but her letter would carry weight. She had taught in these parts for 15 years and knew how to phrase things properly. I cannot stand silent, she wrote, while a widow and child are driven from their rightful property through violence and deceit. The land deed was verified by our county clerk, yet certain parties seemed determined to circumvent the law through force. She looked up as William entered, his hat in his hands. Just finished, she said, sanding the ink. Judge Harrison's a fair man. He'll want to hear about this. Much obliged, Miss Bennett. William watched her seal the envelope. How long you reckon before we hear back? 3 weeks for the letter. To reach him. Perhaps 2 more for his reply. She met his eyes steadily. Can you hold out that long? William nodded grimly. We'll have to. At the church, Karen sat with Thomas at the organ, their fingers moving over the keys. The boy had taken to music naturally, finding comfort in the familiar hymns. His small voice joined hers on Amazing Grace, filling the empty church with sweet, clear notes. The preacher stood in the doorway, listening. His conscience had been troubled since the attack. Silas's latest visit had left him more unsettled than ever. Build your railroad elsewhere, he had told Silas. There's plenty of land. That ain't the point anymore, Silas had sneered. Can't. Let folks think they can stand against progress. Bad for business. His threat had been clear. Support the railroad, or watch church donations dry up. Now, watching Corinne and Thomas at the organ, the preacher felt shame burn in his chest. He approached them slowly. That was beautiful, he said when they finished. Thomas, you have quite a gift. The boy ducked his head shyly. Corinne squeezed his shoulder. Reverend, she said softly, we're grateful for all you've done. He raised his hand. Don't thank me. I haven't done enough. He straightened his shoulders. But that's going to change. William returned to the church basement that evening, moving stiffly from his day of walking. He found Corinne mending Thomas's shirt by lamplight. Jim Cooper's. With us, he reported. Some minors, too. Miss Bennett wrote to the judge. He eased himself down beside her. It's a start. Karen set down her sewing. What about Silas? William's jaw tightened. Time's coming to face him square. Can't hide down here forever. You're not fully healed, she protested. Healed enough. He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle. Gotta strike while folks are? Starting to see through his lies. Thomas stirred on his palate. Are people going to help us, Mr. William? Some are, son. Some are remembering what's right. William squeezed Corinne's hand. And sometimes, that's all it takes to turn the tide. The church pews creaked under the weight of the congregation as sunlight streamed through frosted windows. William sat rigid beside Corinne and Thomas, his ribs aching beneath his Sunday coat. The sermon drew to a close, words about justice and mercy hanging in the air. Before the final hymn, William pushed himself to his feet. His voice carried clear across the hushed room. Begging your pardon, Reverend, but I got something needs saying. Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Corinne touched his arm, but William stood firm. Most of you know what happened at my cabin. His eyes swept the faces before him. But you don't know the whole truth. Silas Kettering didn't just burn us out. He stole legal papers that belonged to Corinne's late husband. Silas rose from his seat near the front, his smile cold. Careful with accusations, Boone. Those papers, if they existed, are gone now. Lost in the fire you likely set yourself. The deed was registered, William countered. County clerk confirmed it. That land was promised under treaty law. Treaties change, Silas drawled. Progress don't wait for wild tales about lost papers. The preacher stood at his pulpit, visibly trembling. His hands gripped the heavy Bible he'd been preaching from. No, he said, his voice quavering. Not lost. The congregation watched in stunned silence as he opened the Bible's leather cover. From between its pages, he withdrew familiar folded papers. I found these, he admitted, the morning after the attack. One of the men dropped them while fleeing. His hands shook as he held them out. I was afraid to come forward. God forgive me, Corinne gasped. Thomas gripped her hand tight. The county clerk, sitting in the back pew, stood up. Those are the same papers I verified. Land deeds legal as they come. Silas's face twisted. You sanctimonious fool, he snarled at the preacher. You have no idea what you've done. But the mood in the church had shifted. The schoolmarm spoke up. We all saw what you did, Silas. Burning out a widow and child? Shame. On us for letting fear rule us, Jim Cooper added from his pew. Other voices joined in, condemning the violence, the lies, the theft. Silas looked around wildly as his supporters melted away. With a final curse, he shoved through the church doors and fled. William put his arm around Corinne's shoulders as she wept in relief. Thomas pressed against them both, his small face bright with hope. The preacher carefully handed Corinne her papers, restored at last within God's house. The sound of hammers rang through the valley as neighbors worked to rebuild William's cabin. What had begun with 3 men grew to nearly 20 over the days. Miners, shopkeepers, and farmers all lending their strength. They built the walls twice as thick, using fresh-cut pine logs that would weather many winters to come. Karen stood, watching from beneath a snow-dusted spruce, clutching a pot of coffee she'd brewed for the workers. Tears traced down her cheeks as she witnessed their dedication. Just weeks ago, these same townspeople had turned their backs. Now they labored shoulder to shoulder, determined to right their wrongs. Near the edge of the clearing, Thomas sat atop the black stallion, no rope or bridle needed. The horse that had once dragged William through the snow now stood gentle as a lamb, content under the boy's small hands. Thomas whispered something in Apache to the creature, and its ears pricked forward attentively. William paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow despite the winter chill. His ribs still ached, but less with each passing day. He watched Karen move among the workers, pouring coffee with quiet grace. She was no longer just someone to protect. She had become his partner in all things, her strength matching his own. That evening, after the workers had gone home, William lit the lamp in the nearly finished cabin. Its warm glow caught the copper highlights in Karen's hair as she tucked Thomas into his new bed, a gift from the carpenter's wife. The boy fell asleep quickly, smile curved on his young face. William's heart felt full to bursting as he watched them. He cleared his throat softly. "Karen?" She turned, lamplight dancing in her eyes. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "This cabin's meant for a family. Would you and Thomas? Would you stay? For good?" Karen's eyes welled with tears. She crossed to him, taking his weathered hands in hers. "Before my husband fell, he prayed that if anything happened to him, the Lord would send someone to watch over us." Her voice trembled. He said he trusted God would provide. William squeezed her hands gently. "I reckon he did provide, for all of us. I was alone too long. You and Thomas brought life back to these hills." "Yes," Karen whispered. "Yes, we'll stay." Through the window, the stallion nickered softly in the falling dusk, as if adding its approval to their newfound joy. Spring painted the valley in tender greens and golds, washing away winter's harsh memories. Lambs dotted the meadow like clouds come to earth, their bleating mixed with children's laughter as they chased each other through sweet grass. The rebuilt cabin stood proud against the mountainside, its fresh-cut timber and sturdy walls glowing amber in the sunset light. Karen's wet laundry snapped in the breeze as she pinned sheets to the line, humming an old hymn. Near the freshly plowed field, William's patient voice carried across the evening air as he showed Thomas how to guide the plow horses. "Easy now, son. Let them feel your confidence through the reins." The boy's face shone with concentration as he mimicked William's stance, his small hands steady on the leather straps. The horses responded to his gentle commands, turning the rich earth in neat furrows. Reverend Matthews stood at the fence, his Bible tucked under one arm as he watched the scene unfold. "The Lord's mercy shows bright here," he said softly to Karen. "Like spring itself, bringing new life where winter laid waste. We're grateful." "Every day," Karen replied, touching the cross at her throat. As darkness settled over the land, stars began to sparkle above the peaks like scattered diamonds. The black stallion, once wild as the wind itself, grazed contentedly near the cabin, its coat gleaming in the last light. William stood in the doorway, Corinne and Thomas beside him, watching night paint the valley in purple shadows. Laughter drifted from inside where dinner waited on the table. Prayer and song would follow, filling the once silent rooms with joy. His hand found Karen's, squeezing gently. Here stood his family, not born of blood, but chosen by love and forged in trial. Justice had prevailed, and mercy had restored what hatred tried to destroy. The lonely mountain man's heart was full at last. If this story made you pause, reflect, or even smile, don't forget to subscribe. I post daily, and the next story might be exactly what you need to hear.